Hello, and welcome to an episode of Meet the Music. Today we're going to start our series with Is Jazz Dead or Is Jazz Dead in the USA? I welcome our first guest, Martin Johnson. He's a New York-based freelance writer. Since 1984, his work has found its way into numerous leading outlets, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, Vogue, Rolling Stone, Essence, New York Magazine, Slate.com, Huffington Post, Black Voices, and many more, including 4 books. He has been a columnist for Newsday, The Root, and the New York Sun. Presently, he's a frequent contributor to the Wall Street Journal, NPR Music, and Jazz Times, as well as active blogger. Mr. Martin Johnson, welcome to Meet the Music.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Appreciate it. So let's get right into it. I reached out to you, and the reason I reached out to you because I saw that musically, jazz has kind of took a nosedive as far as sales, as far as consumption, as far as listeners. It's not seem to be capturing new listeners as it did back in the 40s and 50s. So I just wanted to talk to you and see where your thoughts are, being a reviewer of jazz music and being, I guess, assume a connoisseur of music. What your thoughts are?
Well, very little in America is the same as it was in the 40s and 50s. In the 40s and 50s, you had jazz clubs lining every major avenue, both in New York and in many cities. The number of competing musical genres and other forms of entertainment make it utterly impossible for an apples to apples comparison. While it's commonplace to point to the rise of rock and roll as something that diminished jazz's importance, there are a complex series of things. Jazz became an art music around the time that you're speaking of, post-war America. It also television happened. First network television, then cable television emerged in the 80s. Then came the medium that we are meeting on, the internet. And in addition to that, video games. Whereas jazz more or less had something of a monopoly in urban America in the 40s and 50s. It is, of course, a niche now, but everything in music that is not either popular hip hop, popular country, Taylor Swift, or Beyonce is a niche. So so at some level, its commercial presence is minuscule compared to where it used to be. Its commercial presence is perfectly consistent with, say, where death metal is, or something like that. I mean, it's by dint of having such a broad array of choices, we've become a nation of music geeks, or at least those who choose to pursue it have become a nation of musical geeks. So I don't look at overall sales figures to be an accurate reflection. Otherwise, you could probably make a similar argument that hip hop is really hurting. And of course, commercially, it is not. It's just a matter that streaming in particular, the whole idea that music simply isn't consumed now the way it was 25 years ago, much less the way it was 75 years ago. So it's a different thing. Is jazz dead? No. In fact, I think jazz is immensely well alive. Jazz has, there's a jazz musician, Kamasi Washington, who routinely headlines Coachella, the biggest music festival in America. If you had told me or any of my peers 20 years ago that would be the case, we might have laughed you out of the room. Yet I've been to Kamasi Washington concerts at places where jazz is never ever played, simply because the halls are too large to accommodate, um, most jazz musicians. And I've attended Kamasi Washington concerts in these venues that hold 2,000 to 3,000 people, and the venues are sold out, full of young people. And on top of that, when the DJ plays John Coltrane or Pharoah Sanders or Sonny Rollins before Kamasi comes on, the kids get it, and it's like, whoa. But I think that I don't think that jazz fan is a brand in the way that it was in Jack Kerouac's day, and or even when I was in my 20s or 30s. The anecdote I come back to all the time when I speak on panels or that sort of thing is 12 years ago, no, 14 years ago, I was involved in opening a bar, and as is the
As a
case,
as a co-owner.
as I was involved in opening a bar as a consultant, and I was helping set up the cheese program. And as is the case with a lot of endeavors in life, it's a series of waiting to hurry up and then hurrying up to wait in cycles like that. And so we had, after a phase of that where we had passed our inspections, and the owners decided to go get a cup of coffee or something, and I was there with one of the grunts, guy that I'd gotten to like very much because he was a music obsessive like me. It was just he was a young Scottish kid whose musical obsession was Radiohead. This is 2006. This makes all the sense in the world to me. I love Radiohead. Well, at any rate, we're there waiting around for about an hour for the first shipment of wine. This is a wine bar. This is a big moment. Um, and we start chatting, and he mentions to me, "So do you know this Brad Mildew?" I was like, "Meldau?" "Yeah." And what happened was he was on Pandora listening to Radiohead. Meldau happens to have recorded covers of a few Radiohead tunes, and so that got swept into the mix. And he was utterly fascinated, having been a fan of music that involves synthesizers, guitars, drum kits larger than my bedroom, things like that. And here he is. Here's this band playing the same music with just a piano, an acoustic bass, and drums. He was utterly fascinated. He has gone on to become a huge fan. I'm not sure he knows that you can play jazz with a saxophone yet, but trios, Hank Jones. I mean, we're on Facebook. We follow each other on Facebook, and every now and then, I will see him post his latest, discovery, and it's like Red Garland. It's stuff that only jazz geeks know. And yet, is he a jazz geek? No, he's a Radiohead fan. But the world that endeavor took him down the rabbit hole of piano trios. So there are many other avenues by which people arrive at jazz. There's, to my thinking, an entire genre that we in the jazz business call jazz adjacent. The people who've come out of the Kamasi Washington West Coast get down scene, who are you know also filling very large venues like Terrace Martin or Thundercat. There's a huge scene in London, for instance, where people like Shabaka Hutchings and Nubia Garcia are filling large venues with a music that blends where they're coming from. It's definitely of the jazz tradition, but it includes things like house music and African and Caribbean elements as well. Because if you're a part of the London Black community, that's part of the diaspora that is being celebrated. So, and the most important thing, I think, people would get on me for calling this the most important thing. It's a very significant thing, at the very least, is that in the 60s and 70s, many jazz musicians engaged in sit ins and protests and things like that, not just for civil rights, but for recognition of jazz's artistic significance by the Academy. And so now you don't just have jazz programs at conservatories like the New England Conservatory of Music or Berklee College of Music or whatever. You have it at major universities like Wesleyan and Columbia and USC and things like that, and NYU. So you have a lot. There's an institutional support for the music that didn't exist 50 years ago. Um, and lastly, within that, the music has developed its own institutional infrastructure. Jazz at Lincoln Center, the Kennedy Center, the Smithsonian. These are SF Jazz. These are all organizations that do that. Provide both avenues, outreach, artist development. So, in a lot of ways, the jazz ecosystem, which was once very much dependent on record sales, because they were records, and if they sold, it was good. If they didn't, it was not so much. Um, Jazz's health is very much independent of record sales in a way that few genres are.
Right. So you touched on a couple of things there, but one of the things that I observe is that we no longer have. Well, Detroit has lost their jazz station.
Mm-hmm.
We have stations that have programs that share jazz. Whether it be 4 hours or 8 hours of a day. But your major universities, as you mentioned, are the ones that are supporting jazz on air.
Mm-hmm.
And so, with that, there's somewhat of a span of listeners, but you have them either the West Coast, East Coast, or like you said, UK. You have pockets. You don't have the country as a whole, except in that genre, I guess. I mean, because of the cross pollination of jazz touching Caribbean music, or touching hip hop, or touching R&B, or being influenced by those, and having like Robert Glasper, he's winning. He's on Blue Note as a artist, but he's winning a Grammy for R&B.
Mm-hmm.
So can you speak to the fact that, as far as the pipeline is concerned, they have musicians going into jazz, but what's the pipeline for the growth of listeners or music appreciation for jazz?
Streaming.
Streaming?
In exactly so many words. No. Okay, so.
Well, I mean, as you say, streaming, I read that 90% of jazz music is streamed.
Mm-hmm. A few years ago, I don't remember why I was doing this research, but I was looking at the music of Lee Morgan, one of the great trumpet players. I had proposed a book on him in the early 2000s, and I was revisiting his music, and I was on Spotify, and I noticed that most Lee Morgan tracks that I was interested in had maybe 30,000, 40,000 streams at most. A few of them had 10,000 streams. And there were one or two that had deep into seven figures, like 7-8 million streams. And so I reached out to his label, Blue Note, and said, "What's up with this?" And they were like, "Oh, it's these compilations and playlists that Spotify has that are driving that." So I then decided just to go artist by artist, and Miles Davis had half dozen tracks that had 20 or 30 million streams. Duke Ellington had a half dozen tracks. I think it's one of these things where within the streaming world, it's the algorithm working in the same way that it works at Amazon. I mean, I'm from Chicago. I started toying with the idea of buying a Chicago Blackhawks hoodie, and now I can't go anywhere on the web without some little box suggesting, well, the Chicago Bears, that might be a good hoodie too, and stuff like that. And I think that with music, it works very much the same way. I mean, on Spotify and on YouTube and many other places. So I think that becomes, in a lot of ways, that becomes the radio. There are certainly jazz podcasts out there, and also every jazz station has an internet presence, and so I worked at WKCR, Columbia's radio station, for 10 years, and I'm often reached out to on Twitter about did you hear the Sunraw special WKCR did the other day or something like that? It's by somebody in San Diego, or it's by sometimes it's by somebody in Switzerland, you know? So but by the same token, there are local music scenes that are developing. Los Angeles, Chicago it seems like you can't go a year without some Chicagoan just like blowing up. Micaiah McCraven, Junius Paul. There's so many Nicole Mitchell. There's so many very interesting ones. I was an avid campaigner last year. My record of the year was by Tamika Reed, and I thought she was a phenomenal cello player out of Chicago. So you have local scenes that have their own infrastructure, but you will also have whether this connects nationally, I don't know, but I know that I've heard, you know, I've been, should we say, friendly acquaintances with Robert Glasper for about 15 years, and friends with Jason Moran for about as long, maybe a little bit longer. And you know what those two have in common besides instruments and diversity of taste, right? Houston, Texas.
Ah,
And they are always updating me on the cats that they hear from back home. So, you know, they're certainly, I'm cheating a little bit to say that Dallas Fort Worth has a scene, because it's mostly Denton, Texas, which is just to the northwest of the Dallas Fort Worth area, but still, um, the University of North Texas has spawned its scene. There's a scene in Wichita. One of the great pleasures of going to jazz festivals around the United States is to see and hear how many people are coming out of scenes that you didn't know that I didn't know existed. You know, there's a scene in Fayetteville, Arkansas, and of course, when you say that, you think, "Duh, University of Arkansas, of course." But you know, until you hear the music, you're like, "Really?"
yeah, yeah. My eyes are going up. I'm like, okay.
So
So
yeah.
yeah, I just not to cut you off on your thought process there. When I was investigating Zydeco, as a
Hmm.
genre,
Hmm.
I came. It led me to Houston,
Hmm.
and in Houston, there is so much music there that I was clueless to, and it can be. Um, oh, I don't know. The scene there seems like it's popping just if they were in LA.
Hmm.
That's how I took it. I mean, and those, like you said, those who are from Houston, they come back and help promote the festivals that are on there. So I mean, they cover a lot of genres there
Hmm.
in Houston, and I think that it was a festival they had that just had all genres that come out of there or kind of were birthed in that area.
Oh yeah.
So
Yeah,
yeah,
you know, one of the dirty little secrets is that the music scene in general is decentralizing a lot. And one of the main reasons is that here in New York, it's just too darned expensive to be a struggling artist and pay your rent, unless you have a very good situation. So I know a lot of artists who've come here and either gone back to where they were from or had to find other locations. One of the best saxophonists I know is rarely heard on the New York scene, though that's how I got to know his work, because he lives in Barcelona. A lot cheaper.
wow. I mean, but he's an U.S. citizen.
He's a U.S. citizen, and guess what? There's a whole scene of expats in Barcelona that have nurtured a jazz scene that now includes a lot of locals. Ditto Tel Aviv, ditto Oslo, ditto Munich. Um, there was but pre-pandemic, I used to hang out at a craft cocktail artisan pizza place around the corner from me because one of the mixologists was French, and and I could count on him if I visited him for an hour to spend me a half hour of French hip hop and a half hour of Parisian jazz, and all of it was stuff that I'd never heard before.
Right. Yeah. You touched on a phrase that I watched that Quincy Jones documentary, some time ago,
Mm-hmm.
and Duke Ellington said to him, "Here's a guy who's going to decategorize music."
Mm-hmm.
And so, to a question to you, do you think that's how jazz will grow legs is the the pollination of it
Oh,
in
for
other
sure.
music.
Oh, for sure. Jazz created lots of fans through music like the classic hip hop record "To Pimp a Butterfly" by Kendrick Lamar, because Glasper was involved in it, Kamasi was involved in it, and it came from it. Some of the musical inspiration came from a jazz mentality, and so you had that. You have a lot of projects of that ilk that lead people down the rabbit hole in the same way that Meldau's Radiohead covers led my Scottish pal down the rabbit hole.
The sampling of the Tribe Called Quest, they're sampling.
hmm
Yeah.
Sampling and, in fact, having Ron Carter on a record play with him.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, and those are classics at this point. So, classics of American music. I mean, Rolling Stone recently did a 500 revised their 500 greatest album list, and one of the most important criticisms or critiques of the list that I've seen is that we're reaching a point where albums are almost secondary and to people's experience. Yet, when people do come upon a great record, the common example, of course, is when they come upon the Beatles, Sgt. Pepper, or the Rolling Stones' Exile on Main Street. But there are dozens and dozens of jazz records that have that unity and consistency of high performance throughout, and so perhaps relevant to the very moment. If they come upon Max Roach's, you know, the Freedom Now suite, We Insist, it's like the greatest playlist ever. When your mentality has been um, short tunes to come upon an extended 40 minute work like that.
I was looking at the liner notes for Billy Joel, 52nd Street the other day, and I saw Freddie Hubbard and I saw Dave Grusin
Mm-hmm.
in the credits. I was like, when I was playing that back in the 80s, and I was going through the liner notes then, I guess I just didn't see it and didn't pick up on it. And it's like amazing that, all these musicians are in these studios with all of these different genres of music.
Oh, for sure,
Yeah.
and always had been. I mean, you know, you could you could geek out for hours naming the jazz legends that are on Steely Dan records, whether it's Wayne Shorter on Asia, or Phil Woods on Katie Lied or whatever. And yeah, because it was all music. I talked to Billy Joel briefly about that. And he was, he had just done a classical music record, and so natural question. So, if you're expanding, are you going to try jazz? And he was like, "No, man, I had jazz musicians in some of my records, and it'll be another lifetime before I can play like that."
At least he's a man enough to admit it.
Oh, he was a very personable guy. I was very pleased.
Yeah. You mentioned Spotify's playlist.
hmm
So, what's your thought on contextualizing music there, or even on YouTube, where you've got rainy day jazz, or you got work jazz, or driving jazz, or even Friday jazz? I mean,
whatever works for the listener. I mean, I don't need that level of presentation, but I could readily imagine a situation where people that are close to me and curious might, and more power to them if they investigate it, and it enraptures them in some way. I'm not
yeah,
I'm not opposed to I'm not opposed to packaging and lures and stuff like that, because people don't have the advantage I had when I was growing up, buying records at in this record section at the back of a bookstore across the street from the supermarket where my family did its shopping. I mean, I would, while we were checking out, I would run over there, and the stoner behind the counter would say, "Hey, little man, So, have you heard of this? And I'm like, well, no. All right, little professor, you got to get this, and I'd spend my allowance on this record that I hadn't heard of by an artist I had heard of, and it would turn out to be Aretha Franklin's "Young, Gifted, and Black," and I couldn't wait to get back the following Friday with my allowance and say, so what do something the equivalent of what do you got for me this week? That doesn't
Right.
happen anymore. So that's not a commercial, um, that's not a setting that people can do this sort of thing with. So, if as far as I'm concerned, if they've heard whatever and they pick up on, a rainy day jazz thing and they hear Dexter Gordon playing some classic and become completely enraptured with the tenor saxophone and the sound of it and start poking around, works for me. I mean, people have to meet music on their terms. I fully remember coming in one day to the apartment building that we lived in, and a neighbor's pharmacist saw a pop record under my arm and lectured me about why I should be listening to more John Coltrane. And I was 12. I mean, by the time I was 16, I owned a lot of John Coltrane records. But you had to you have to I don't think any genre of music it works well to hit people over the head with it. They have to come to it on their own terms.
So, uh, well, I'm trying to figure this out. Where do I go from here with the question? You have a Taylor Swift
Hmm.
who does, 100,000 sales in a quarter,
Hmm.
and you have a genre itself that does that in a year. Um, I don't know. In my mind, I know jazz will never be at the level of pop. I get that.
Right.
But I mean, the rapid descent has taken since, I don't know, since smooth jazz was introduced. I don't know. I don't know when it took the dive or when it reached its peak. But, how does the trajectory change? Do we have to have somebody? Well, I mean, I would think somebody like Kendrick Lamar with his album, he's a trusted source. If he had a, a world tour and he had, jazz artists on stage with him or opening an act for him, would that be something that would change the trajectory?
I
As a,
think it would
as a trusted source.
maintain the situation. I mean, I think that jazz has had a fairly marginal status in the larger music world as measured by sales for 20 years now. So I don't think this is anything anybody's panicking about. I mean,
Oh,
could it
you mean
increase?
as musicians? Musicians are not panicking about it. Is that what you're saying?
Oh,
Or they,
I would say okay. So I'm old. I turned 60 this year. Um, so in the
congratulations.
early 80s, we would have people up at the radio station, and one fine bass player in particular would often tout this book called "Rock and Roll is Here to Pay." Like there was going to be some jazz revenge on rock and roll for marginalizing it, and I would say okay, call me when you make some progress on that. But in general, jazz has found so many other ways to fortify an infrastructure and permanence that is independent of commercial record sales that I don't think there's going to be any substantive rebound, but I do think that its presence in the marketplace is guaranteed. And sure, And it's a funny thing. We're so deep into the pandemic now. I don't know when a tour that is attended in the same way that Coachella used to be attended or something like that would happen again. I don't know. We're talking. I think we're talking 2 to 3 years out on that sort of thing. I mean, I think Europe, sure, because Europe did the right thing with this pandemic, and with the exception of minor flare-ups that are part of a second wave, um, life is resuming some sort of normalcy because we handled the COVID-19 crisis about as badly as it could be possibly handled and are continuing to handle it about as badly as it could be possibly handled. Um, it's, the sheer the sheer fear factor of going to a restaurant is still very, very high. Going to an indoor venue with 10,000 other people yelling, yeah, that's at least 2022 and probably 2023.
Yeah. I believe you're right, my friend. I mean, as sad as it is to say, I believe you're right. I know, all of the virtual festivals that took place in replace of,
Hmm.
being on site. I don't know how successful they were, but they were attempted.
Yeah,
But and that brings up the point of then, uh, does it become uh, a national endeavor, from, I mean, not that I want with the government involved, but the government has arms like the National Endowment of Arts.
hmm,
Yeah. So, is do they champion, you know, music?
absolutely.
Uh,
There's a series of jazz masters. I don't remember the exact number. I'm going to say 5 or 6 that are given out every year. It's a substantial cash prize and notoriety that typically goes to some of the top tier veteran performers in the music and has been for, I think, over a decade.
yeah. So, I mean, because our festival here in Detroit, we have a free jazz
Hmm.
festival. It attracts like 300 something thousand.
Hmm.
You have the festival in New Orleans, the Jazz and Heritage. It
Hmm.
attracts, close to 500,000. But then you've got a Super Bowl game that attracts, can't even break 100,000. It may get to 100,000, it may creep over 100,000, but on average, it's below 100,000. But then they have 100 million viewers
Right,
around the world.
right.
So does should the the American music itself be featured that way globally, and somebody take up the torch, or some organization take up the torch and present it that way?
Um, Super Bowl's the Super Bowl because people like to watch sports. I mean,
But I mean,
go ahead.
everyone loves a live. Everyone, well, it's not a live performance because you're not there, but to sit down and view a concert, a live performance, it's an experience.
Oh, agreed, agreed. But I don't think that I I think that people, I think the major change that has happened with the internet and music is that people can dive down whatever rabbit hole suits them. I mean, I have friends that when they start talking about music, it is all going straight over my head. And I look up the genres, I look up the musicians they're talking about, and they're in genres that I didn't know existed. And I have a pretty solid grip of what's out there. But I think that, oh, here's a good way. Bear with me 1 second. I will give you a really good example in, what is it, fewer than 10 seconds here. I'm working on a project with somebody, and he wrote something today about that Rolling Stone list, and I wanted to remember the number he used in the story, and I don't. But right, okay, so there's a website called Every Noise at Once, and
Oh yeah, I'm
it
familiar with that.
literally has a list of 5,000 genres and
Yeah.
hundreds of subgenres within those genres. I mean, this is why there's not. This is why, for instance, Taylor Swift's and Beyonce's sales numbers, honestly, they pale against what Mariah Carey used to put up in the 90s or Whitney used to put up in the late 80s. The music scene has just become so much more fragmented that expecting large numbers, I wouldn't expect large numbers of people to be excited about much of anybody unless, I don't know, unless Prince came back to Earth.
Yeah.
Exciting.
Yeah. I found that website that it found it very interesting.
Mhm,
I was like, yeah,
mhm.
you go from just the basic 10 genres to find out that there's like close to 14, 1,500 genres, and then you go to that website and it's like, whoa, wait a
Yeah,
minute,
exactly.
because I saw that was you have acapella, but then I thought I saw metal acapella,
Hmm.
and I was like, wow, blown away by it, but. Uh,
Yeah, no, music tastes have been fragmenting for a long time, and the internet and the way in which um, niche taste can be catered to so readily has just fragmented it even more.
I think I have an idea for an app.
Hmm.
Uh, there was a app for all recipes. I think that's
Hmm.
the name of the app. It was on my first iPod, and but basically, what you could do is for a meal, you could spin for the country, you could spin for the type of dish,
Hmm.
and and it would come back with a recipe for from that country, that whether it be breakfast, lunch, or dinner. What you select an ingredient, but just the same with the you could do that very same thing to discover new music or discover
Hmm.
new artists,
Hmm.
to do that kind of an app. So hopefully when this goes live, not live, when we
Hmm.
put this on the internet, somebody will pick it up and run with that. Um, so going back to um, pre-described or the jazz as traditional contemporary. So you think that's just still going to continue its path, and then it will grow on top of that, where you have. I guess the question doesn't make any sense the way I'm asking it, because you had Miles Davis break away from kind of the bebop thing and go into the fusion scene,
Hmm.
and he kind of got criticized when he did it. But from there, it became Herbie Hancock, and then from there you've got Robert Glasper. I mean, you've got all these guys who are putting a spin on jazz by these other influences. And like you said, in the UK, they're doing the same thing over there.
Hmm.
In fact, they don't even consider. I mean, when somebody comes up to them and has a conversation about traditional, well, this is not traditional jazz, they don't argue with them.
Hmm.
They just say, "This is okay. Well, that's your take on it, and this is how we're going, and this is the direction we'd like to see it go."
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah, no, nobody should be policing somebody's influences. I mean, I think that I, I simply cannot imagine a young musician growing up today hearing only one genre of music.
right?
I
Yeah,
mean,
I
I
agree.
told,
My kids agree.
yeah, I told a good friend of mine whose teenage son was a guitar player, and he asked me for some of the guitar players I was excited about, And I told him in particular Mary Halverson, who had gotten a MacArthur. By the way, that's another really solid, what's the right word, emblem of jazz's institutional penetration, is that 2 out of every 3 years, the MacArthur Foundation is giving an award to a jazz musician. Maybe it's even 3 out of every 4. And Halverson had received one in 2019, and I mentioned her to my friend, and he came back to me to report that his son, who is mostly into obscure forms of metal and psychedelic folk and things like that, his son said, "Oh, Dad, everybody knows her." And my friend came back to me and said, "Well, keep me appraised as to when she's playing, because I think I have to prove my bona fides now by taking him to one of her gigs."
Oh, I'm sure that blew his mind.
Yeah, no, he was fully thinking this is that his son's musical universe had expanded beyond his musical universe, and this was his way of catching up. And in fact, nope.
That train has left the station.
Yep.
Yeah. All right. So, final question, I guess, or final comment, or that you can share with us. Do you have any reviews coming up?
Did you read the NPR piece? It's only a couple of weeks old. I did a piece for NPR,
Yeah,
so
I
okay.
did.
The NPR piece on Black Jazz Record Revival. I mean, I regard that as a hugely important piece, because I want, for most of the last decade or more of my work in jazz criticism. Jazz criticism has been this kind of hip part of the academy, right there alongside new classical music and other forms of avant, pop or whatever. Um, and I would really like jazz to kind of be reconnected to its roots as African American rebellion culture. And the the revisiting of these labels that started at a time where music labels were more than happy to tell you how to be black. I mean, corporations telling us how to be black. So this independent movement started up. I just found that incredibly important. I have I have a bevy of pieces that are part of the Jazz Times upcoming 50th anniversary issue, and also I think their November issue as well. Um, I do a fair amount of blogging and the umbrella for most of the things that I blog about is at rotations.wordpress.com. Um, and I do, well, this is timely enough. I do have another Wall Street Journal piece coming up later this month on said guitar player Mary Halverson and the second record by one of her projects. But yeah, that's the most of it. I
Well,
mean, I
Mr.
have
Martin.
other things that I'm working on, but it's too early to discuss, if you know what I mean.
Sure, sure. Well, Mr. Martin Johnson, I appreciate your time, and I just wanted to say right here that your writing is, I mean, it's captivating. I mean, I'll sit down and read something when I expected nothing from it, and I get all this information, all of these points of view, and it's I love it. I mean, I read a lot, but I don't find writers that just captivate me or capture my attention like you do in your writing. So
Oh, thank you.
I wanted to let you know that whatever you got, man, it's magic, and don't let it go. And I appreciate your point of view on the jazz world. Well, again, Mr. Johnson, I truly, truly appreciate your time.
Oh, thank you.
And it's very, very grateful for the opportunity to talk with you. And I hope that I can snag your time, some more time in the future. Maybe we can talk about funk
Sure.
or something else. But stay safe.
Thank you. You too.
Yeah. And next time my wife and I are in New York, we'll hit you up.
Please do.
All right. Good luck to you, Mr.
All right.
Johnson.
You too. Thanks.
Take care. All right. Bye-bye. And you've been listening to another episode of Meet the Music. Our guest was Martin Johnson. We spoke about jazz, whether or not it's dying here in the USA. And as you can tell, he was very passionate about his listening habits, very passionate about his take on the ecosystem of jazz. So hopefully that whetted your taste buds, and some of the names that he dropped, we'll have a link to some of those artists in our website for you to hit and listen and maybe download for yourself. Again, thanks for listening to an episode of Meet the Music, our podcast here heard once a week. And so enjoy the next episode. Until then.